Welcome to the first installment of our Thrips Identification video series. These videos are designed to teach growers and IPM professionals how to identify thrips they might encounter in the greenhouse. Thrip species covered are relevant to Canadian greenhouse crops and likely also applicable to those in the northern U.S. states bordering the Great Lakes. These videos were adapted from our in-person workshop series that we ran in 2024. In this video, we'll go over a little background on why you would want to ID thrips and the creation of the identification tools we designed for growers. We'll get into more detail about how to ID thrips in the next videos. If you're watching this video, you probably already know what thrips are. These are tiny insects that belong to the order Thysanoptera. Although there are thousands of thrip species, only a small proportion of these are crop pests. Here in North America, western flower thrips, or Frankliniella occidentalis, is the species most commonly found in greenhouse crops. Because this species is highly resistant to many different pesticides, it is typically managed with biocontrol-based IPM strategies. In the early 2010s, floriculture growers in Ontario started noticing more frequent or severe thrips outbreaks. Growers who had thrips IPM programs that were working well for years were suddenly not able to keep their thrips populations at bay. Since different species of a given pest often respond differently to various management techniques, some folks began to wonder if there was a new thrips species that had arisen in Ontario. Dr. Sarah Jandrusik at the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness began surveying thrips species in ornamental greenhouses in southern Ontario starting in 2016. This was the first time thrips species had been surveyed in Canadian greenhouses since the mid-80s. Because western flower thrips had been so prevalent, thrips species identification had largely been ignored over the previous 3 decades. What she found was that although western flower thrips were still the dominant species, onion thrips made up a substantial proportion, about a third of all the thrips they collected. 2% of thrips collected were Echinothrips americanus, and only 1% of thrips collected were species other than western flower thrips, onion thrips, or Echinothrips. But in the intervening years, more and more exotic thrips species have been found. These have primarily been intercepted in ornamentals, but a few have made appearances in greenhouse vegetable crops as well. But why are there so many new thrips species, and why is it happening now? There are a few possible explanations for this. The first is that we're moving plant material around the world more than ever. There's been a steady increase in global trade of both rooted plants and vegetative cuttings, both of which can potentially harbor thrips. There's also been a recent boom in tropical foliage houseplants, many of which are propagated in warmer climates before being shipped to Canada for finishing and sale. Another explanation is that the environment is becoming more hospitable, and this is true both outside and inside the greenhouse. A warming climate increases the odds that pests from warmer regions will be able to survive outdoors in Canada. Inside the greenhouse, reduced use and availability of harsher insecticides might also improve their odds of survival. Lastly, the more you look, the more you'll find. When we routinely identify thrips, we're more likely to find exotic pests that have previously not been recorded. That also means that we're now in a much better position to intercept these pests early, which is much better than waiting for a big outbreak to clue us in. Growers and IPM scouts have limited time, so it's not feasible to identify thrips species every time you scout your crop. So when should you ID your thrips? The short answer is that any thrips activity that's out of the ordinary warrants a closer look. For example, if you have a reliable IPM program that suddenly stops working, or an outbreak with no obvious explanation, or if the thrips damage looks different, or it's in a crop that doesn't usually struggle with thrips, or if when you observe the thrips in your crop they look different or they're behaving differently in some way. Any of these can be warning signs that you might have a different species. We don't want to alarm anyone, and Canadian growers should know that except in tropicals, most thrips will be western flower thrips or onion thrips. But it's important to be aware of other species so you don't become overconfident and ignore any of these warning signs. So if species ID is so important, why weren't people doing it before? Well, first of all, thrips are just really, really small. The second, and possibly the most important barrier, is that the existing identification tools were just too difficult to use. Traditional taxonomic keys were designed by entomologists for entomologists. More than that, they're designed for entomologists who specialize in taxonomy. They're very detailed and require a lot of specialized training to even begin to understand all the jargon they contain, much less put it to use. For thrips, the identification features found on traditional taxonomic keys requires a compound microscope, which growers are unlikely to have. This is a thrips as seen under a dissection microscope. In order to use a traditional taxonomic key, we need to look much closer. For example, we might need to look at the shape of the base of a particular antennal segment, or we might need to zoom in on a particular body part to locate tiny pores like these. Typically, a traditional taxonomic key includes hundreds of species found in a given geographic region, many of which are not crop pests. Increased global trade means that the potential pests in greenhouse crops are equally global in nature. So these geographically limited keys don't include many of the potential species that we might come across in the greenhouse. They are, however, a necessary evil. These detailed keys in the hands of trained taxonomists are required for official identification. Here in Canada, if you need to confirm a species identification, you can send samples to the National Identification Service at the Canadian National Collection of Insects, Arachnids, and Nematodes. However, this process can take time. For everyday use, we designed a key specifically for growers and IPM consultants. It uses features that you can see with a 40 times magnification dissecting microscope. We've also done our best to write it in clear, easy to understand language. We've included species that are typically found in greenhouse crops, as well as a few potential species that have been popping up in greenhouse crops in other parts of the world. Because of its simplicity, this key cannot be used for official identification. You'll still need to send samples away to a taxonomist for that. But it can tell you the most likely species or rule out other species. And it can get you those answers very quickly, which can help inform your pest management decisions in a more timely manner. We update the key regularly as we encounter new species, and you can find the latest edition on the On Floriculture blog. Now that we've set the stage, in our next video we'll talk about thrips life stages, important identification features, and how to tell the difference between male and female thrips. Visit the On Floriculture blog for a copy of the thrips key and more identification resources.